Hi, this is Jim Cunningham. We're going to talk about retirement pitfalls in California, as well as other states in the country. But our firm is based in California, so we're going to talk about California. We're also going to talk about just retirement in generally. What are the pitfalls to look out for, and how do you avoid them? Right. So these are things to avoid, things that might come up, and you just go, "Gee, I'm really worried about that." So if you're retiring, in fact, I was talking to one of our employees today, and she's thinking about retirement. She's like, "Gosh, I'm getting closer to retirement, and I'm looking at my 401k, and I'm getting really nervous, right, with all the recent market volatility." So we're going to talk about that. If you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the YouTube, but click the subscribe button and then the thumbs up. If you like it, please, we love those. And if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and put those in the comments if you're watching this on YouTube. And do you know inheriting assets could significantly impact your financial future? So what we're talking about is a lot of people, the inheritance they get is a big part of their retirement. So this is very, very common. We see this increasingly now, especially in California, where it can be very expensive to live here, very expensive to retire here. So many people, when they inherit, they can finally retire. So that is not uncommon. And real estate annuities, large retirement accounts, these can all impact your financial plan. These are all taxed differently, especially the annuities and retirement accounts. There are estate tax consequences, capital gains tax consequences. We'll talk a little bit about that, as well as income. So again, buckle your seatbelt, get ready. We got a lot of great content. This is all about preparing and preparation. Don't not prepare. Don't not pay attention to this. If you put your head in the sand, you can have a suboptimal outcome. So really, you should be paying attention to these things. I'm Jim Cunningham. I'm a partner at Cunningham Legal. I've been an attorney for 30 years, more than 30 years. We have offices throughout the state of California. I'm a certified specialist in estate planning, trust, and probate law, a real estate broker, securities, insurance licensed, and a single engine pilot, a pilot single engine land, instrument rated, not current. And we have 17 attorneys in our law firm now, and we're getting ready to add a couple of more. So you will see more faces up there in the weeks and months ahead. And joining us today is Shannon Behan. She is a certified financial planner from Ascent Wealth Management, and as a frequent guest on our YouTube page here and our podcast. And I'm really excited to hear about what Shannon has to say about retiring. And she's going to be doing a lot of talking here, but she's going to be talking about just these pitfalls to avoid in retirement. And I know retirement can be really scary for a lot of people. Very important. This is the legal disclaimer. Right after this disclaimer is going to be Shannon. I will let her talk. There will be the disclaimer for Ascent Wealth Management, but this is really important. I'm a lawyer. Please, this is not legal advice. Don't take it as such. Don't listen to this. Listen to these videos or webinars or podcasts and go out and do a bunch of stuff without appropriate legal advice. If you're not represented, feel free to reach out to our firm for help. And Shannon, I will let you give your disclosure, and then you can take it away.
Thanks, Jim. Likewise, I'm a certified financial planner, but everything that we're going to talk about today is just general information. So every case is different. Every person's financial situation is unique to them. So please don't, take any action based off what I say today without consulting an expert that really knows your situation.
Well, what impacts retirement plan success? And Shannon, just a little bit of background. You deal with a lot of retirees, right?
We do, yeah. And I think that is driven by the fact that most of the time people think that's when they start asking themselves these questions that they need help answering, right? So we deal with a lot of clients that are in those years leading up to retirement. And then, of course, those first few years transitioning into retirement can be some of the most, let's say, question filled or uncertainty filled because it's just a new way of living. It's that switching from accumulation phase to distribution phase. So there's a lot of financial questions around that time period. It was interesting as I was thinking about what are the things that I want to touch on today and what are the things that are really important when we think about retirement success. And of course, the old adage, like it's the one of the biggest impacts is not starting early enough. But if you're watching this webinar, that might not be something that we can fix. But if you are still very young and have years of accumulation, save more than you think that you need to save, start now. But really, we kind of see people run into hurdles in a few distinct areas. So that's kind of how I organized these bullet points here is we'll talk a little bit about expenses. What are some of the things that people kind of underestimate when they're thinking about how much they're going to spend? What are some of the things they forget to think about? We'll talk a little bit about income and taxes. That income strategy creation for retirement is really important. You stop getting a paycheck, where is your income going to come from? You've saved all this money, but it's not just as simple as turning on the spigot. You really need to have a plan for that. So we'll talk about why some of those things are important. Spousal misalignment, we're seeing this more and more too. As I was preparing for this, I read a stat that, just almost made me fall out of my chair. Since 1990, the divorce rate for people 65 plus has tripled. So we're
Wow.
seeing this more and more, people having to kind of reevaluate financial plans when they're already in retirement. And then last but not least, Jim, you kind of mentioned a lot of these things already. It's like just planning ahead. You really need to kind of think about what are some of the variables that you are considering in retirement. One thing we've been seeing a lot recently is people considering retiring abroad, and there's some really unique challenges there. So we want to bring up these things so you're thinking about them and able to plan appropriately.
Yeah, when you talked about young people, is it too young to invest? That's one thing with my kids are all in their 20s, and that's one thing I've really focused on with them is start saving
Mhm.
early because that compounding interest, there's some figure, and I've seen this kind of out there in the ether. If you save from 18 to 25, $2,000 a year versus 25 to 65, you end up with the same amount of money, which is really hard to get for people to get their head around. And then you might have someone who's 18 who says, I can't possibly save $2,000 a year. And, we can debate that. But it's really this sort of the power of compound interest, and the more time you're invested. I mean, that's why vampires are so rich, right? You watch these vampire movies or whatever. It's like, wow, that guy's 300 years old. No wonder he's rich, right?
You've had
Because he's
time to
got
build it up. Yeah,
good time to build it
absolutely.
up, right?
Absolutely. One of the things that we come across a lot when we're dealing with helping someone build that retirement plan is a discussion about budgeting. And what we're looking at here, the image on the screen just shows different categories of different types of expenses and how they might change over time. And one caveat that I would point out here is, this shows a sloping down expenses from 60 to 95 plus. And while that is generally the trend that we see, I do think we talk to a lot of people who say, oh, when I retire, my expenses are going to go down because they think that they're going to, downsize their home, or they're going to, not have as much income taxes from income that they're earning from their job. And while over time that might be true, what we actually see is a tendency for expenses to tick up in the first few years of retirement. We call those the go-go years, followed by that kind of period of what we call the slow-go years, when you're really settling into retirement, maybe aging a little bit, traveling not quite as much. And then, the end of the picture here would be the no-go years, right? When you're maybe dealing with a little bit more healthcare expenses and those sort of things. But for the majority of people, we see a slight uptick in the beginning of retirement and then maybe a trend downwards. The other thing I want to point out about this visual here is this does not include taxes as an expense. And especially for people who have worked their whole lives and been piling money into their 401k, like you said, Jim, following that advice
Right.
of deferring, they end up with these very large balances in tax deferred retirement accounts that then have tax bills associated with them when they start tapping into them. And that, for a lot of the retirees that we work with, is going to be one of their highest expenses in retirement. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways to consider that and plan for that. And then the last thing I would point out, and this one we do see a lot, particularly in California, is this assumption around fixed housing expenses. We might have families who've been in California a long time, who've had real estate here for quite some time. Maybe they no longer have mortgages, those are paid off. And when they're budgeting out into their retirement years, they sort of assume a flat cost for housing expenses. But think about what just happened this year with, the fires we
Oh,
had here in Southern California.
yeah.
Cost of insurance, likely not going to be flat into the future. Property taxes, I would expect those to go up over time. We're going to see things like HOAs, maintenance costs on homes ticking up over time. So we do see that also as something to just be aware of when budgeting is maybe think of those housing costs over time as ticking slowly upward rather than being kind of a fixed expense.
Yeah, with the Eaton and Palisades fires in particular, we have a client who's an Ascent client and Cunningham Legal client, and they had a reverse mortgage on a property and lost their home. And I will tell you, losing your home in a fire, there are all sorts of crazy consequences, and it's very disruptive to your retirement. So, and you would think that if living in the Palisades, you would think that living in Altadena, which are urban areas, that you would not have an urban massive fire like that. And I think a lot of people assume that. I live in an urbanized area, and I don't really think that there's going to be a big fire, but these things, they can happen. So, well, what could somebody do? If someone says, "Gee, I live in a fire-prone area, my insurance might be getting canceled." And by the way, even if your house burns down, this is one kind of like insider tip on retirement. Make sure that you have enough insurance on your real estate, because a lot of times the insurance coverage won't remotely cover the cost of rebuilding, right? If your house burns to the ground. So that's something you need to be really mindful of. But
Mhm.
is that something that I don't even know how you would plan for that? Like, oh, gee, if my house burns down, you have insurance, but I guess you would just pay attention to the insurance, make sure you have adequate insurance on that, right?
Exactly. It's about that level of insurance and making sure that stress testing essentially your plan and saying, if the worst case scenario happened, what would that do to the long-term longevity of our plan? And we're seeing people making decisions about, exiting homes that maybe are in areas that could
Yeah.
potentially in the future be a little bit more fire prone. They just want to take that risk off the table. So, I wouldn't let that be the driving decision, but it's certainly, in terms of a financial plan, it's just thinking about God forbid, if the worst case scenario happens, how am I going to rebound from that?
Inflation. Oh my gosh.
This one's been a big one the last several years. And I think one really, really important thing to think about when you're talking about inflation in terms of retirement is that inflation does not apply to all categories of expenses equally, right?
Right.
So what we're looking at here are some charts showing the average, the bottom one in the blue shows the average inflation by spending category, averaging about 3%. But if we look over towards the left, that healthcare number historically has been 4.5% since the 80s.
Wow.
That is 150% the average inflation. And then when we combine that with the fact that for most retirees, the top chart there with the green shows the percentage of spending in each category. For people 75 plus, look how much of their spending is healthcare. So 16% of spending for individuals 75 plus is on healthcare. And if that big chunk of their expenses is inflating at a rate 1.5 times what the other expenses are inflating, you've really got to consider the long-term impact of that. And for us, that really comes around longevity as well. That's a really unique thing about being a financial planner and having these discussions is, there's an end date to financial plans. And it's kind of, to look somebody across the table and say, well, when do you think you're going to die? Those are tough kind of conversations to have and plan for. But I think for a lot of people, they might think that retirement might be 25, 30 years, but in actuality, what we're seeing is 35, sometimes even 40 years living in retirement. So we really need to make sure that our portfolios are built in such a way that they can handle this inflation should longevity be more than we would expect.
It's interesting. You talk about inflation, and you were talking about healthcare in the 80s. I think the healthcare probably today is better than it was in the 80s, right? Technological advancement.
Which is why retirement is longer for a
Right,
lot of
right. So it's
people.
a compounding effect. And my wife and I were watching this show. It's on Apple in, I think, Prime. It's about basically longevity and all the technology that's out now, and in the next 10 years, what they're talking about is extending people's lives, basically not only extending the length of life, but more importantly, the quality of life. So, to
Yeah.
live to be 95 and not healthy for 15 years is not fun. But if you're healthy until till you're 95, that's kind of cool. But you may be spending a lot of money to stay healthy. So,
And you're out there doing things too because you're
yeah,
healthy and you feel good and you're out there
right.
spending. So it all kind of adds up together to become one of the largest influences on the successful plan.
Well, I will just call it now. I'm making it to 100. I'm going to do
I
it.
believe it.
All right.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Um, this is kind of a catch-all to really hammer home one of the most important things that we see when we see this a lot with people who are early in retirement. They might be making decisions about that seem rather simple, right? We just had this with a client actually. They wanted to buy a new car and they wanted to just pull funds out of their investment portfolio. In order to do that, they would rather not have financed it. But that might not always be the best thing to do. Even if you have those portfolio assets available, you've got to consider, retirement is really, it's dominoes. All of these things are connected. So by making one small decision about, taking a lump sum distribution out of a portfolio to pay cash for a car versus financing it at a low interest rate, those can have long-term effects because you're then taking that part of your portfolio out. It's no longer able to benefit from that compounding growth rate that we talked about before, and can really have, a $50,000 car right now might mean 750,000 in portfolio assets over time that you no longer have when you're in your 90s in those, last bit of healthy years that you've got there. Same comes with, as I mentioned, creating that retirement income plan for yourself. I think a lot of people think we'll just start taking distributions from our portfolio, no problem. We've got it built up for us. That's what we're going to do. And while that is certainly a part of the overall income plan, the difference between taking those assets, for example, from a trust account where you might pay capital gains tax on something that's, appreciated and you've got to sell it, versus taking those funds from a retirement account
Right.
where you're paying actual income tax, or even if you've been lucky enough to accumulate a Roth account where there is no income tax on those distributions. You've really got to be strategic about which accounts you tap into and when, so that you're mindful of what tax bracket you're sitting in, how that's going to impact you in the future for your income tax liability once you start those required minimum distributions. So for now at 73 or 75, you're going to have to start taking distributions from your retirement account. And we can really be strategic about, do we start taking distributions early so that those required minimum distributions aren't so high? Things like pension decisions, whether I cover just myself, whether I take a slightly less pension amount, cover myself and my spouse. We see this in California a lot too, wanting to pay down a mortgage. I completely understand that, wanting to be, debt free. I think that's a great feeling. But when you've got a mortgage that you are able to refinance in 2020 and it's 2%, it might make sense to hold on to that mortgage and let your assets continue to accumulate. So all this just to say that every single one of these decisions here that you see on the screen might seem like a small or simple decision that just has one impact. It's really ripples throughout your entire financial plan that can really decrease the probability of success of a plan. So you want to be making sure that you're working with somebody who can help you plot out how each one of these decisions is impacting the future.
Yeah, Shannon, as you're talking about this, I'm thinking of so many examples with clients, and it's very common for clients a lot of times, maybe between age 75 and 80, when they buy that new car. And a lot of people do buy a new car because it is the last car, right? I mean, you're going to keep it 10 years. But you raise a really interesting point is, do you sell some securities and then have to pay capital gains tax? Or should you just model it out and get the financing on the car and pay it over time? Or if you sell some securities, look at some other ones. Like if you're selling winners, right, where we have a capital gain, maybe there's some losers in there and you can take a capital loss. So you zero out the tax bill or come close to zeroing out the tax bill. And this really is I think I will tell you the benefit of using a certified financial planner versus just any old investment advisor, because the certified financial planner has the training, whether it's you or another certified financial planner, you have the training to look at these different, and you have software tools available that kind of help you model this out. And so if you're buying a car for 50,000, it might make sense to plunk down 20 and then finance 30, but then be mindful and make, you might pay it off in a couple of years. but you're being mindful about it. So less money, ultimately, less money goes to the government in tax because remember, taxes, income taxes, capital gains taxes are confiscatory taxes. What that means is that wealth, that money that you give to the government that's confiscated lawfully, you're never getting anything back from it. Now, that's a little bit different than Social Security and Medicare tax because there's a social benefit on that. But these confiscatory taxes, I think, really should be avoided at all costs. And I'm just going to make just a blanket statement. Like, why would you unnecessarily pay tax? I don't think anyone we obviously want to pay what we owe and the lawful amount we owe, but we really don't want to pay a penny more. So enough about that. Next slide.
Well, and I think it also, those decisions, it also really matters what's happening in the market, right? So, one thing that you may have heard us talk about before, if you've seen us on other webinars, is the sequence of returns risk. And this is a little technical, but I think it's really important because
Yeah.
it illustrates the importance of a few different, retirement planning pitfalls to avoid. So, for example, with stress that we've had in the market recently, if I had a client come to me and say, I want to buy a car, I want to take $50,000 out of the market, I'm going to try to pump the brakes on that because things are under a little bit of pressure right now. And the last thing that we want to do is sell into a market that's under pressure, right? Because we're going to be selling the shares that we already own. And then in the future, when those prices rebound, we now own less shares or fewer shares to participate in that growth rebound. So on this slide and the next, we compare two different scenarios just to show you how much that can impact someone's overall financial plan. In this first scenario, we've got David, who retired at the end of 1994. We're looking at one investment account that was $250,000. He started withdrawing 5% a year, which was $12,500 when he first retired. 1995, 96, and 97, as you can see highlighted there for the S&P returns, were absolutely outstanding years. So David retired into a market and started taking withdrawals when the market was just soaring. So he was taking out some of the growth, but there was still additional growth in his portfolios. So we fast forward 20 years in that scenario, 20 years into retirement, that 250,000 that David started with in this account at retirement is now over $1 million. And he's been taking that 5% withdrawal every year. Now, if we look at the next slide and the next scenario, Monica retired a few years later at the end of 1999, same account size, same withdrawal amounts. Unfortunately, she retired into an environment 2000, 2001, 2002, which were 3 negative years in a row. So on top of her portfolio value going down because of market performance, she was also taking withdrawals. So then when we get to 2003, when the market rebounds quite substantially, she now has much less invested to participate in that rebound. So fast forward for her 20 years into retirement, she's looking at 95,000 versus the situation that we just saw, which is over $1 million. So the sequence of returns or the type of market that you are retiring into really has a huge impact on the long-term accumulation of a portfolio. And that's why it's so important, as you can see over there on the right, this really illustrates for me 3 important things. The first is not overspending early in retirement. We see this a lot. People get excited. They want to, start buying RVs and boats and retirement homes. And while we want people to enjoy retirement, we don't want to spend too much in terms of lump sums up front, especially if the market is under pressure. The second thing that I think this is really important to point out is relying on a single source of income. Now, of course, we're talking about 250,000, so this is not, likely Monica's entire asset pool. But if all she was relying on was withdrawals from an S&P portfolio, she would really be struggling to be successful long term. But if you can create a retirement plan that has multiple opportunities for income, whether that's, creating guaranteed sources of income with a tool like an annuity, for example, or just different types of portfolio income, we could very easily put together a municipal bond portfolio that's going to create more income with less volatility than this equity portfolio that we're looking at. So having that diversification of income sources is important. And then the last one, I always want to mention this when I talk about retirement, because I think that 4% rule, Jim, have you heard of this? I
Oh
think
yeah,
it's
4%, right. Rule of thumb.
that gets stuck in people's heads and they think, oh, I can take 4% out of my retirement account, no problem. Well, what we've seen is that that rule of thumb was created when life expectancies and retirements were much shorter. They're much longer now. And we're also entering very likely an environment where the average returns across, the S&P, for example, will likely be slightly more muted than they were in previous periods of time where there was a little bit more market performance. So that 4% rule of thumb, while it's kind of a good starting place still, you can't rely on that as gold. There's got to be other considerations. That's why I say other sources of income, having parts of your portfolio that you can set aside to say, hey, I'm going to draw on this for my next expenses. So even if the market is under pressure, I know that I've got this set aside for me to provide income so that you've got options. We never want you to be backed into a corner where you're having to sell something when you don't want to. That's the last thing.
Well, I would say if somebody, we're recording this in 2025. If somebody is retiring in 2025, let's just take someone who's 65 years old, retiring with $1 million in an IRA, and they haven't taken Social Security. They might have a little bit of savings. Should they even be? I mean, what do you suggest to people? Should that $1 million be fully invested? Should you dollar cost average over a period of time? What's and I know it's hard because advice is tailored individually, but what are some approaches I would characterize it?
Yeah, exactly. So it would depend so much on the individual situation, the lifestyle that we were trying to maintain. But just in general, typically speaking, when we come across someone who has a sizable retirement portfolio, it's generally already invested, right? And so it depends on the choices that they've made up to when we are interacting with them. Some people have taken that rule of thumb of getting more conservative as they get closer to retirement. So we meet people whose portfolios are on the more conservative side. We also see people who have portfolios that are totally risk on, equity investments. So that appropriate risk tolerance is going to be based on, your overall financial picture, how much you need to withdraw on. But from a, very high level, some of the things that I would want to look out for is diversification in that portfolio, right? So the scenarios that we're looking at right here are assuming pure investment in the S&P 500. That's the largest 500 stocks in the US market. You want to diversify. You want to own other sizes of companies. You want to own fixed income. You want to own alternatives, things that behave differently than the S&P 500, so that when things pull back, there's other parts of your portfolio that, maybe are not pulling back quite so much to add that little bit of a ballast. You can also create guaranteed income streams with retirement funds. So again, not for everybody. This is not a blanket recommendation, but you could take a part of that retirement account for you that you've accumulated and kind of create a pension for yourself that'll just create an income stream for you. Those have been attractive recently because of the interest rate environment. So there's a lot of considerations to be made, especially when we see someone with a big retirement plan or big retirement account. How are we going to start realizing that income? Do we want to start taking distributions now? Do we want to look at things like Roth conversions? What's the need for legacy planning? Do we care if our heirs are going to have to pay income taxes on whatever they inherit? So there are so many variables that come into play. It's tough to give, high level recommendations.
Yeah, and I'm looking here at questions that are so by the way, if you're watching this on YouTube, one of the great things about coming to a live webinar, and we do these at typically Thursday at noon Pacific time, is you can ask questions and we answer them. We typically answer them and don't put them on YouTube, but this one I think it is appropriate to be here. Anonymous asks regarding the 4% rule, the RMD at age 73, which is the required minimum distribution from an IRA. So you're not working, you've separated from your employer. It's not a Roth, it's an IRA. So you have to start taking money out at age 73, and in 2033, it's age 75. But the RMD, the required minimum distribution, starts at 73, starts at 3.77%, 74 is 3.92, and at 75, the RMD goes over the 4% mark. And thoughts and suggestions. Well, it's interesting because you're talking about this quote 4% rule, but your RMD, now all that RMD means, by the way, is you have to take money out of your account. It doesn't mean you have to spend it. It could go into an investment account, but you do have to take it out And this is critical. If it's an IRA, you have to pay tax on everything that comes out. So it's what we call zero basis asset. So that money comes out, it's all income. So if you take out 100,000, you have to report 100,000 on your tax return. So you're going to have a little bit less, but you can set that money aside and invest it. You don't have to spend it, right?
Mhm.
Per se. But how does that interplay? People are in their 80s and they've got RMDs that are well above
Mhm.
4%. How do you, what sort of tax planning or what planning do you do with those guys?
Sure. Jim, if you could do me a favor in advance, I think it's 3 slides. There's a
Yeah.
cash flow slide that I think actually really is illustrative of this problem. This is a snapshot of planning software that we utilize in our office with our clients. This is just one of many reports and screens that we use to kind of visually look at someone's financial plan. In this case, this couple is planning to still work for 2 more years, then retire. So you can see that in this bar graph here, every bar is a year, and that red line is the couple's total expenses. It goes up over time because it also includes taxes, which, as I mentioned earlier, is one thing that I think most people don't think about. So that red line is the total expenses. That's how much they need to have go out the door, to your point, Jim. That's the spending
Right.
level. So right now, the first couple of years, that light blue that you see, that's salary that's still being earned income. So the total expenses is a little bit higher because they've got income tax on their earnings. Then at retirement, in that third bar, you can see that Social Security kicks on. That's the dark blue. That teal color is other income. That could be a pension. That could be income from real estate investment properties that they own. And then in order to meet their total expenses, so their living expenses, that's the red line, you'll see that there's the yellow that fills in there. That's withdrawals from their portfolios. And so that's really what we're talking about in terms of the 4% rule, is withdrawing and spending a certain percentage of your portfolio. In this particular case, you can see when the orange bars kick on, when RMDs start out into the future, in those later years, the RMDs are above total expenses. So what that is telling us is those numbers that you mentioned, starting at 3.7, escalating beyond 4%, they're having to take out more than they actually need to live on, and it's creating additional taxes for them. So when I look at this as a planner, one thing I think about is, okay, they've got these retirement assets out into the future. Let's start taking some distributions now. And this I know can be counterintuitive because, as you said, Jim, nobody wants to pay taxes that they don't
Right.
have to pay. But what if we start taking some distributions from retirement accounts now, early in retirement, start paying income taxes on them now at lower brackets than we would be later? Because what that accomplishes is it sort of levels out that income tax line. So rather than being low and then going high over time, it kind of levels it out. We fill in those tax brackets when we're not earning income before we have to start taking. We can also do that with Roth conversions as well. Take some of that money that's in a tax deferred retirement account, pay taxes on it, convert it into Roth now. So this, for me, this graph is a planner's dream. It's just options that we can really get creative in terms of doing some planning.
Yeah, and for those of you who have taxable estates, these would be estates over essentially 14 million, and you have a retirement account, the effective tax, the real world tax rate's about 95% on an IRA. Now, and we covered this in other webinars, but a lot of our clients who have the larger estates, let's say you have a $30 million estate and a $5 million IRA, you really do want to look at a Roth conversion because the money you pay in tax is not included in the estate and not subject to estate tax. There's a complex formula where you get an income tax, a federal income tax deduction for estate taxes paid in a prior year, but it's very complicated. And I say it's kind of like trying to get a VAT refund when you go shopping in Europe. It's possible, but a lot of times it doesn't happen because it's so gosh darn complex. So that's where I come up with the 95% number. So we'll go back a couple of slides. Let's look at the hierarchy of income.
This is really just an illustration of that point I was making about having diversified sources of income. And this for us highlights kind of how we would earmark the most solid type of retirement income plan you can have. That bottom part of the pyramid, those essential lifestyle expenses. So that's your housing, that's feeding yourself, that's basic transportation. The more that we can cover those with guaranteed income, whether that's pension income, Social Security, whether that's an income stream, that a pension you've created for yourself through a vehicle like an annuity. We want that to be income that you know you can count on regardless of what's happening in the markets or other parts of your portfolio, so that you can sustain yourself. That next part, discretionary lifestyle, that's going to be travel. That's buying that new RV that I mentioned. Those are expenses that we want to think of as spending down the portfolio assets that you've worked so hard to save over time. And then that tip top, the legacy, we deal with this a lot for families in California, especially where there's a lot of real estate, there's a lot of equity in that real estate. What do we want to leave to the children, the grandchildren? What does that look like? So it's a wonderful position to be in, to have to do some legacy planning as well. But oftentimes that's going to involve things like trusts and other structures to make sure that your wishes are really carried out the way that you want them to be.
Yeah, and if you have grandchildren and you want to see them and your kids can't afford to live in California, there are many planning mechanisms to keep your kids in California, but you do have to be really careful because there are gift taxes. If you make a gift of over $19,000 in a given year, you do have to have a report that gift. Now, you may not be paying taxes on it, but that's one of a really important um, goals that many of our clients have. They may live in coastal, more urban California, and it's very expensive. I was just talking to my wife this morning. She says, "Oh, I saw this report, and the top five least affordable places in the United States, 4 out of 5 are in California." And if that's you and your kids are struggling to pay for housing, and you want to see your grandchildren, that's something to think about. Like how do you help them? And we have other webinars on that, how to help a child buy a property, and how all those pieces kind of fit together and maintain family harmony. Social security strategy.
This is a
Now,
biggie.
let me ask you, Shannon,
Mhm.
get out your crystal ball. Are we going to have Social Security? Because when I started working and paying taxes, people said, Social Security will never be around. My parents are in their early 80s, and I heard them growing up, it's never going to be around. We're not planning to receive it. Is there any news on that, or is it going to run out of money in 2033? What's going on with that?
I think it's very likely that we will have some form of social security network when I get there, let's just say. What it's going to look like, I don't
Forget
know.
about you. What about me? I'm 55, right?
You're going to be fine, Jim. Don't
Okay.
worry. So I think this will always be a point of conversation. It's
Yeah.
something that is a hot topic when it comes to, turning on the news, and this is something that gets people really fired up. So I do expect that there will continue to be funds. I think the people that are going to be the most impacted are very likely the younger people who are paying into it now and will very likely have decreased benefits in the future. If benefits are already being paid, I think those are going to be harder to touch. Or for people who have, are closer to retirement, I think those will be the benefits that are modified later. People who are still in those accumulation years, still paying into the system, they might get less than they expect to get in the future. But you can, if you turn to Google and you can get any opinion that you want on this, there's a lot of talk about how a lot of the voting base is younger and will continue to be younger. And so they will vote. They would be expected that they would vote certain ways to maintain Social Security. But in terms of planning, when we are planning for clients, we plan to include Social Security.
Okay.
We don't want it to be the only source of income, but we do include it in planning, certainly. But we do stress test. What if this was, what if we took this out, or what if this was decreased by 60%, or those kind of very negative scenarios. We constantly get asked the question about when to start Social Security. And I think for me, if I was to make a list of the common pitfalls, starting Social Security too early would be one of the most common retirement pitfalls that we see. But that also has to do with tummy factor, Jim, because I think a lot of people are nervous it's not going to be there. And so they want to get what they can while they can still get it. But from a long-term picture, oftentimes it makes sense to wait. What we're looking at here is the very bottom, the gray, is an example of a benefit if someone started it as early as they can at 62. They'd get about $2,800 a month. If they wait till their full retirement age, they would get $4,000 a month. So if they wait till 67, their full retirement. So the break even on that is 77 years old. So if you live to 77, you will have received more from Social Security if you waited to file until you were 67. So that's the break even there. You could also delay and wait till you're 70 and get even higher benefit, almost 5,000 in this case. The break even on that between full retirement age and waiting till 70 is 81 years old. So if your life expectancy is beyond 81 years old, you will have received cumulative more funds from Social Security by waiting until you're 70. Now, that is just simply the numbers based on the monthly benefit and waiting. There are so many other factors, as I mentioned, about dominoes and things that are all attached to each other. If you're still working, if you're still earning income, we do not want you to start Social Security. That does not make sense. Will your spouse rely on your spousal benefit? One of the things that I put some slides in here is about the impact of losing a spouse. One of the things I think people don't think about is losing that second spouse's Social Security. If you start your Social Security early, the spousal benefit that your spouse will receive will be forever decreased as well. So you're impacting their future benefit as well. It also matters if you're going to spend it. Do you need that money to live on, or will it be going into an investment portfolio? And if you are going to be spending it, but still need additional funds, where are those additional funds going to come from? Do we have to take portfolio withdrawals to do that? So this is really, it is a dollars and cents conversation to a certain point about the break-even age, but that decision needs to be made in the context of your overall plan.
So on the break even, did you factor in, is it just simply the dollars, or when you modeled this out, did you assume that people at age 62 who took 2,800 a month turned around and invested that money, or does it change it that much? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And in this case, it's just talking about the actual dollars that they've received. The modeling is just assuming that you're spending every single one of those dollars. But to your point, Jim, that really matters. Are you going to take this and invest it and be able to be in an environment where you're earning 9% on it? That totally changes the picture. So all of those things matter.
I would say, just from anecdotally in speaking with clients, those who take Social Security at 62 typically need it, right? They just don't have the income. And so, again, highly personal decision. If this break even 77 or 81 or whatever it is, and you don't think you're going to live past 70, if someone comes in, they say, I'm not going to live past 70, should I take it at 62? What's your answer?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right.
We talked about that. Retiring abroad.
Oh, retiring abroad. Okay. Let's define abroad. Is this outside of the United States, or would this include Guam and Puerto Rico? And do you understand what I'm saying? Because those are different tax. Like in Puerto Rico, you pay to the hacienda, you don't pay to the IRS.
It's a different tax regime.
Different tax regime. Guam, really far away from where we are, but you don't pay to the IRS. You pay to a different tax regime. Now, let me ask you, on the IRAs, if you take a required minimum distribution and you're a resident of Puerto Rico, you're not paying to the IRS, are you? Are you paying to the hacienda?
No, and that is one of the things that we always talk about with people when they're considering retiring abroad, is that tax obligation. We see this a lot with Mexico as well too. We've got several clients who want to retire to Mexico. And Jim, almost kind of like your point about that, credit that you can get back for estate taxes paid.
Yeah.
A lot of times people end up going to Mexico, for example, and ending up with double taxation. They end up paying tax in the United States and they end up paying tax in Mexico because they're not working with a professional who understands everything that needs to get filed to get certain exclusions or to get certain rebates back for taxes paid in a foreign country.
Right.
So these are very complex decisions, and you need to be working with someone who really understands the intricacies of all the laws.
I mean, I did find out that this came up last week in kind of a study group I'm in. Somebody was inheriting, who's a German taxpayer, so they live in Germany, inheriting a Roth IRA. That is income under German law. So they have to pay German income tax on a U.S. Roth. So we have a lot of clients whose children work abroad. Naming a successor trustee who is not subject to the jurisdiction of a state court or the District of Columbia means it's a foreign trust. So if your kid is a resident of Puerto Rico or a resident of Guam or a resident of the UK, that's a real problem when administering a trust. So all these little weird little things. So if you've got these issues, or if you're thinking about retiring abroad, but let's talk about this. Let's say somebody who says, I saw the 3rd episode of White Lotus and I just love Thailand. We're in the middle of White Lotus right now, the 3rd season, or third season, I should say. It's in Thailand. They retire in Thailand. What's what are the things we should be looking out for if we're going to retire abroad?
Yeah. So anytime anyone ever brings this up, the first thing I say is you need to speak with a local expert that is familiar with all of the rules because of everything that we're seeing on the screen here. So tax implications, like we just touched on, super important. You need to have somebody who knows the ins and outs. Also, visa and residency issues. We see this a lot. I think sometimes people think it's easier to establish residency in another country than it oftentimes is, especially when you are not going to be working in that country. You have to oftentimes prove certain levels of income to sustain yourself or have certain asset levels in order to even become a resident in the country. Monaco has a very high, you have to make a payment in order to become a resident of Monaco. So there's all these, as you mentioned, nuances and intricacies. So that local expert is super important. Considering all of your income sources as well. One thing people don't think about is Social Security.
Hmm.
Oftentimes, for most countries that you're a resident in, you're still able to receive Social Security as a resident of that country, but you have to declare that you are a resident of a different country. And there are certain hoops to jump through about certain institutions and institution types that Social Security payments can go to. Private pensions can have the same sorts of restrictions on them as well. So it's not just as easy as packing a bag and heading over there. There's really a lot of nuanced planning that needs to go into it.
So if someone says, I'm retiring to Thailand, they should call you, Shannon, because you can help them walk through all those issues.
I could connect them to the appropriate experts. I can
Great.
help them with the US impact, but you're going to need somebody in the country of residence too.
Great. Spousal age gap. Now, are you talking about what age gap are you talking about? How many years are we talking about here?
Well, this is also something that can really vary case by case, right?
Yeah.
So in my head, the number I'm thinking of is like 12 to 15 plus,
Okay.
is generally speaking where it comes into play. But we've seen couples that are closer, but maybe one's a little bit younger at heart. And so some of these issues still come into
Right.
play. Um, you know, we've kind of laid it out here as challenges and opportunities because I think there's unique situations that couples have to deal with if there's an age gap. Things like retirement timelines. Of course, usually what we see is the older spouse wants to retire a little bit early. Risk tolerance is also something that can be very difficult. We see a lot where the older spouse who maybe is already retired feels very comfortable with risk because their other spouse is still working, so they're still benefiting from that income.
Mm.
They might not be around as long, so their timeline isn't as long. But in the back of the head of that younger spouse, they're thinking, hey, someday you're not going to be here, and I'm going to have to continue the lifestyle that I've had. So oftentimes we see the younger spouse perhaps having a slightly different or slightly more conservative risk tolerance. Different priorities, not wanting to travel, views on legacy planning, especially when we deal with blended families. I'm sure you deal with
Oh,
this a
yeah.
lot, Jim, with estate planning. There might be certain, earmarked gifts for kids of, certain different relationships, which is very tough. So I think that just throws a wrench in retirement planning often, but there's also some opportunities that come from having an age gap. Even just basic things like if you've got one spouse still working, they can provide healthcare for the other spouse as well, providing that income stability in those early years of the first spouse's retirement, right? So there's a little bit less of that draw on portfolios. Social Security optimization, as you mentioned, Jim, oftentimes when people file early, it's because they need it. If there's still income in the family, maybe they don't have to file early, so they can wait a little bit longer in order to file to really optimize that strategy. Retirement asset strategies. This is something that, Jim, you and I have talked about this with a case that we had in the past where if there is a big age gap, it sometimes can make sense to legally take retirement assets from one spouse and make them the property of another spouse through a legal order that gives you flexibility of delaying, for example, required minimum distributions. Now, that's not something simple or lighthearted that we would want to do, but it's just a technique that could be available if there is a big age gap. Use of life insurance is also an opportunity here when you've got two different spouses, two different, ages of spouses. Oftentimes having coverage on that older spouse to provide a lump sum or a windfall to the younger spouse to maintain their lifestyle when they become a widow can be really helpful. Also making sure that you've got long-term care coverage, because if you've got an older spouse that enters that long-term care phase of their life and they need it for quite some time, that can be kind of detrimental to the younger spouse's retirement as well, long
Yeah.
term.
I was speaking with one spouse of a couple, and there's a 15-year age gap. And the older spouse now can't be alone, has pretty significant dementia, Alzheimer's, and the younger spouse is still very active.
Mhm.
And that's an age example. Another one also, and you said just different. I don't an age gap, or maybe it's an age difference in retirement, because I talk to a lot of people, and one spouse is ready to retire, and the other one's like, I don't want to retire. Like, I don't know what I would do. I'm a lawyer. I'm
Mhm.
80. I'm still practicing because I don't know what else to do, right? And the other spouse is like, will you please retire so we can go travel before it's too late? And then, it's too late. So go
Yeah,
figure.
and that's where those different visions come into play. It's really something that's important when thinking about retirement planning. And, it's not included in these slides, but I think for me, one of the most impactful pitfalls that I see people have is not thinking about what they're retiring to. Oftentimes, we view retirement as a goal, and people get there and then the next day they don't show up for work, but they don't have a plan for what they're going to do.
Right.
They don't plan for their well-being in retirement, what
That's
their
scary.
day is going to look like. So it's not just about what you're retiring from, it's also what you're retiring to. So that needs to be included
I
in
would,
a
I would just say
well-rounded
that
plan.
I will tell you, this comes up quite a bit in my professional practice. And one thing we talk about with clients is somebody who says, look, I have my own business. I want to retire, but I don't know what I would do. And some of this is like practicing being retired, which is go on that month trip and don't call the office. Just practice and see if that makes sense for you, or take a week off and go play golf or do whatever you're going to do. But maybe start doing that. But to your point, if you just work, 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 a lot of people like have a heart attack in the first 3 months of retirement because they're stressed out because they don't know what to do. I mean, this is not uncommon, but I would say think about it, be mindful about it, have a game plan, and figure out what you're going to do. Because I'm kind of a doer, like I'm kind of a busybody, and I know you are, Shannon, too. And the thought of just sitting around and doing nothing, yeah, it's not for me.
Well, and if you don't use it, you'll lose it.
Yeah.
That is true. So you've got to make sure that you're staying active. This is one really important thing that we always like to touch on when talking about retirement, especially oftentimes when there is an age gap, or in a lot of couples, the woman is younger. So oftentimes this comes into play for women. Um, there's not a significant amount of planning done, or a sufficient amount of planning done for what her life is going to look like on her own. Because oftentimes what happens when someone loses their spouse is income comes down, whether that's because he had a single life pension or the deceased spouse had a single life pension, because they lose one of the Social Security benefits that they've been having. They also oftentimes are then even
Yep.
in higher tax brackets as well. They're filing in single filer tax brackets versus married filing jointly. The loss of that standard deduction or certain deductions that were associated with the spouse that passed away, and an increased cost of living. I think this is one thing that, people sometimes think, oh, well, if there's only one of me, my expenses are going to be half. Well, that's just not the case. So many expenses are not duplicate expenses. Housing, generally speaking, wouldn't change. So cost of living can oftentimes go up. And changes to healthcare coverage as well can be an unexpected increase in cost. And here's that statistic on the bottom of that last page, Jim, that we talked about, where
Yeah.
the divorce rate for 65 plus has gone up substantially. So you're dealing with all of these issues that we're looking at in a widow's penalty, but also division of assets, losing half the portfolio as well. So
I
it
mean,
can
that's a
be
whole topic for another
very
webinar, is
impactful.
getting divorced after age 65 or something. I mean, because we do
Yeah.
see it. You do see it. And I kind of chuckle because I remember a client who came in and she said, well, my husband divorced me. They were like in their 70s. And he went and married some woman in her 30s. And then he had a stroke. And the woman in her 30s basically went to the ex-wife in her 70s and says, well, okay, you can take him back. And she's like, no, that's your problem. That's not my problem.
You signed up for this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's over, right?
Uh,
It's your deal. So, um,
And then kind of last but not least is really just planning issues. I think, Jim, you see all of these in your practice. We constantly see where people think that they have an estate plan in place. They've gone and worked with an attorney, they've put documents in place, but then they fail to actually fund the trust. Their
yeah.
assets aren't held in the name of the trust.
Yeah, on blended families, I will tell you one thing that a lot of times people don't understand. So what we talk about a blended family is one spouse has children, the other spouse has children, but those are not the children of the spouses together.
Mhm.
And what a lot of plans are written so that when one spouse dies, the spouse that's left, what we call the surviving spouse, essentially has to report to the deceased spouse's children or the former stepchildren. And those former stepchildren are in the surviving spouse's hair for the rest of the surviving spouse's life. So let me say this another way. Two people are married, one person dies. The survivor of the two has to deal with the kids of the former spouse forever because they have like an AB trust or an ABC trust. And those children are going to inherit in the future. And many times we have unwound those estate plans, not always, but in some instances where the survivor gets everything because the survivor can then take away from those other children, the children of the deceased spouse, if those people are really mean to the widow or the widower. And we do see that. So the parent of the children dies, and the spouse, the surviving spouse who's not the parent of the children, has all these duties because they're a trustee. Typically they have all these duties to the children, and they can be complete jerks and make that surviving spouse's life very difficult in later years. So, I think that's something, if you have an estate plan and you have a blended family, you absolutely need to look at that and make sure that it's what you want, because, do you want to be sort of bound to your stepchildren forever? And a lot of people say no, and some people say yes, but again, it's case by case.
Mhm.
So what we're talking about here is using a certified financial planner, estate planning attorney, which would be Cunningham Legal, and a CPA and a tax advisor. So I work a lot with Shannon and the people at Ascent Wealth Management with clients and sort of this three-legged stool. That's really the analogy we use. So a stool with two legs it falls over, right? So the CPA or tax CPA enrolled agent, tax advisor, estate planning attorney, and certified financial planner are really needed in the vast majority of cases. I do want to give a brief update on the Corporate Transparency Act. It is still law. We are recording this March 20th, 2025. Tomorrow, March 21st, 2025 is the deadline. So I personally have a few LLCs. I have complied with the Corporate Transparency Act. There is the Secretary of the Treasury has said they will not enforce the compliance with the Corporate Transparency Act for domestic, meaning kind of U.S. citizen, green card holder, people who own interests in United States LLCs. So LLCs formed under the laws of states or the District of Columbia. But that's very nervous. It makes me nervous when a department head, right, the head of the Treasury says we're not going to enforce it, because they could have a policy change and say we're enforcing it, and the penalty's over $600 a day for non-compliance. So look, the law as written says you need to comply. So that's something we're recommending that our clients comply with this. So this is if you have an LLC. There are a few exceptions. We cover this in other materials, but it's just something I wanted to bring people's attention to. So next up, next week, we're going to cover the benefits of a trust, typically a revocable living trust, avoiding probate and protecting your legacy and giving you peace of mind. I will be doing that on March 27th, 2025. If you're watching this on YouTube, you might have already seen this video, right? So you're like, whoa, what? That's back in time, but we're not at March 27th, 2025 yet. We do have offices throughout Northern and Southern California, and we're within driving distance of most people in the state of California, reasonable driving distance. And if you'd like to contact us, our contact information's here. Also, Ascent Wealth Management. You can reach out to team@myascentwealth, and the Ascent Wealth Management contact information is there. We will open it up for questions, and I will go back to the contact page, but what we're going to do now is we're going to answer questions, but we're not putting these on YouTube. So if you've made it to the end of this video and you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe to one of our webinars, because you can ask questions, or you can actually post questions in the comments as well. So thanks for watching, and thanks for joining us, Shannon, and we'll be answering questions in just a minute.